Alright, hello CodeMash, and welcome to the Badge My IoT Life precompiler or factory project. I'm going to be walking through all the components and steps needed to build the CodeMash IoT badge. If you expand the description of the video, you'll be able to see specific sections if you want to just jump right into something. Okay, the first thing I'm going to show is how to check your resistance values. These do have markings on them, but if you're like me, your eyes just aren't as good as they used to be, and you want to double check them before you solder them on. So I'm just going to show how to check it. You want to turn your multimeter up. Usually there's a little ohm symbol on here, sometimes a continuity symbol as well. So what you can do here is you can simply hold it and then just look at the readout. So this is reading about right at a little under 100 ohm, which is, there we go. If my fingers aren't touching it, it's closer to what it should actually be. So these are all the same. So these are my 100 ohm resistors. I'll set those aside. These all claim to be 4.7K. They probably are, but I'm going to double check. So there we go, 4.68, close enough. You can see the little K on mine. Some of these have auto ranging, some of them don't. All right, this one, okay, this is I'm guessing it's a 10 mega ohm. Yeah, so you see the little M there, stands for mega. Yeah, so this is about a 10. And then this one should probably be the 3 mega. Yep, so it's right around, yeah, right around 3. Okay, so just keep track of them before you, and maybe double check them again before you solder them. They can move around on you. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set my resistors in place. I'm going to start with the 100 ohm resistors. So I'm going to poke one of the legs in here. Do the same thing on the other side, and just be kind of gentle. They're pretty sturdy, but you can bend them, and that just makes it harder to get in. And then you want to kind of pull them through as far as you can get them. You want to try to get them as flush as you can to the board, but you also don't want to have one kind of hanging out there. So it takes a little finessing. So there. So that's about how you want it to look. And then you want to make sure the other ones are consistent. All right, so I've got all 3 resistors in there, and you can tell it's R1, R2, and R3. If you have your instructions, you can also confirm that. So R1, R2, and R3 are all 100 ohm resistors. So I've set them in, I've made them consistent. You really don't have to, but it looks nicer, and you can kind of tell at a glance easily if you got them right. So now we're going to flip them over, and then I'm going to go ahead and solder them in place, and then I'm going to trim them after that. Okay, as you can see, I have them in place, and I've kind of managed the wires so I can kind of avoid them while I'm soldering. And I've got my solder here. I'm using a 6337, which I like, but you can use 6040. I wouldn't recommend using lead-free because it's a pain in the butt to work with. Okay, so put this in. You're basically going to come in here, touch your pad, put a little bit of heat on there. And then you might see the board bubble up a little bit. That's normal. No worries there. You just want to have kind of a nice little, almost like a volcano. And as you can see, I'm only holding it there for a second. So now that we have that done, we're going to come up here and take a look at it. Hopefully you can see on the camera what those look like. So some of these may not be perfect. Actually, they're not too bad. You don't want too much solder, and you don't want too little. These are probably fine. I got a little more on that one, but it's not a big deal. I don't think I have to redo any of those. So that's about what you want them to look like. Then you're going to take your flush cutters, and you're going to come up right underneath them, and you're just going to clip it like that. That's all there is to it. All right, so that's what it should look like after you clip it. Okay, we got those done. Now we're going to move on to the next batch. Okay, we're going to repeat the process with these 4.7K resistors. So based on this, they're going to go right in these R0, or I'm sorry, R10, R11, R12, and R13. and we're going to do the same exact process. Okay, so there's the first one that I just put in. The other thing you'll notice on here is that there's a green stripe, or it might be yellow, I'm not sure. My eyes aren't that good. But just make sure that green stripe is on the resistor, and I'm putting all my green stripes on the top, so that's where I like them. The other thing is, I'll point out, is that this is a prototype board, so your board may be a little bit different, and it may also have the actual resistance values and more information on it by the time CodeMash comes around. Okay, I'm down to the last one. Okay, and they all should be relatively, about the same distance. If they're not, it's not a big deal, but you just want it to kind of look nice. Here we go. So those are all in there. I'm going to flip it over, same drill as before. I'm going to bend these legs back a little bit so I can easily get my soldering iron on there. Keep them out of the way. You can just kind of bend them like that. After you do that, you just want to recheck, make sure they're all kind of in position, and then hold them, drop them down on the table, and then you're going to solder them. So touch the pad. The other thing, you don't want to breathe the smoke, so I usually just kind of hold my breath while I'm doing it. I also have a fume extractor that I normally run, which is, I don't know, it's kind of off camera, but that's really helpful. Okay, so those are done. Now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to kind of inspect them, make sure I don't have anything too rough, which I don't. I'm going to take my flush cutters and just trim them up. And definitely take your time while you're doing this. There's no reason to rush. I've done a lot of soldering, and so it's pretty quick for me. But you can probably count on at least an hour or two to put this board together, especially if you've never soldered before. Maybe add another hour. All right. And if you're having problems, just get a helper. There's plenty of people that hopefully know how to solder in the session. All right, that looks pretty good. Okay, next up we're going to do the remaining resistors and the capacitor. So I've got the 10 mega ohm in my hand here. That's going to go in R4, which is right here on the board. And then the 3M3 is going to go here in R5, and the capacitor is going to go here in C1. So the resistors are going to be the same process. You're simply going to put the legs in. I would recommend double checking the resistance on these. There's only one of each, so it's easy to get them mixed up. You can look at the colors if you want and calculate that way, but I always find it easier to use a multimeter. So I'm just going to check it right now. Plus you'll get a little bit better reading with it on the board instead of in your fingers where it's loose. So yeah, it's right about right on the money. 10 mega ohm. Okay, so poke one leg in, then poke the other. We're going to save the capacitor for last, so I'll go ahead and, oops. Okay, just about got it. And as long as you're happy with it, that's fine. I want mine to be somewhat decent because I'm using it as an example. So I'm probably spending a little more time than I should. Okay, now I flip the board over and I'm going to repeat the process and just solder these down. Okay, that'll do it. I'm going to touch this last one up because I got a little too much on there. Okay. If you got too much, sometimes the tip will just draw it off. It's not a big deal. Remove the flush cutters, or the wires with the flush cutters. And try to get it as flush as possible to the board, because you don't want to inadvertently cause a short, or even worse, snag your clothes, because it's going to be going up against your shirt. You don't want to ruin your new hoodie. All right, so that's what that should look like at this point. We've got all the resistors on. Okay, and the last step is just doing the capacitor. So there's no polarity on this kind of capacitor, so you're just gonna pop it in the holes, and it should fit in just like that. And then you're gonna flip the board over. You might want to hold it when you flip it, but it should stay in with pressure. And just like we've done with all the resistors, same process. Put a little solder on there. There you go. You're done. At least with this part. So flush cutters again. That's looking pretty good. Now we're going to move on to the buttons and LEDs. Okay, these are what the buttons look like. Hopefully you can see that on the video. There we go. So they're just little push buttons. They only go in one way, so you can't get them wrong. And they fit in there pretty well, but you got to make sure all the legs are in the holes, because if they're not, it's not going to work. So that one's in pretty good. So what I'm going to do is place all these, and then after I place them, I'm just going to flip them and just solder all the pins down. These are nice because they stay right in place, and you don't have to worry about them falling out real easily. So see, you can't put them in that way because they're just not going to work. So it can only fit in one way. Some of them you might get a bent leg or two. You can just kind of finesse it a little bit to go in the hole. You might even have to, like this one's kind of a little bow-legged, so I'm going to pull it out a little bit. So I've got them all set in place. Now I'm going to flip it over. And mine are pretty tight. Yours should be too. And they should just pressure hold in there. So then you're going to take your soldering iron and probably work your way from the corner down. You don't want to hold that on there too long, just long enough to get the solder to kind of form that nice volcano. Okay, so there's one button done. And you can see I'm applying heat to the copper, not directly to the pin or the solder. You want to make sure that you cover everything down, so you shouldn't see any of the plate, but you also shouldn't see a big glob. That's what I need to do a little more on. And you just kind of develop a little method for this. Ooh. And then make sure that you've got a long enough wire so you don't get anything that hops onto your finger, like what just happened to me. Doesn't really hurt too bad, but it's more of a, ooh, what was that? Okay, that should be good. So now we're going to take a look and inspect. Here, this one, there's maybe one or two that could use a little more solder, but that's pretty good. So everything still works. I'm going to just put a little more solder. These are mechanical, so you want to make sure they're that you've got them good and soldered down, because you don't want these coming up later. All right, that should do it. Okay, now I'm going to just repeat that process for the other side. Okay, I've set these in place, and I'm just going to repeat the soldering. Just make sure that everything feels right. When you click it, make sure all the legs are in there, and then you just got to solder it just like the other side. Okay, I've gone through and double checked all my joints and touched up a few that were maybe a little not as great. So if I show it kind of at an angle, hopefully you can see the little volcano that we're talking about that you want. You don't want to see any of the copper plate, like this hole here. You don't want to see any of that. You want to see a little mound, a lot like a little mini volcano. So that's how you know you did it. Also, if you see any kind of off, anything that's shiny, or anything that's not shiny, that means you have a cold joint and you want to heat that back up and apply more heat to it. Also, I don't think you're going to need to trim those. If they bother you, if you think it's going to bother you, you probably could. The other option would be to put a piece of tape over the back just so it protects your clothing. from ripping or tearing. I don't think it's going to cause a problem, but if you want to do that, it should be pretty easy to do. And then just double check that all your buttons can move freely. You should hear a click. So all mine are good. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is going to be the LEDs. The long leg is going to be the positive leg. And then on the board, you're going to see D5, D4, and D3. And then based on my instructions, red is D5, yellow is D4, and green is D3. And you can see on the silk screen on the board, the plus is in the upper right, so that means the long leg goes in the upper right. And this is important, so you don't want to get these backwards. Make sure those go in correct. So you need the correct polarity on those. So those just drop right in real nice. You can do one at a time, or you can do them all at once. I think I'm gonna do one at a time. So I'm gonna leave the legs on mine until after I solder it to make sure that I get them right. Okay, that's done. And double check, so I got the plus and the long, which is right. So again, long leg to the right and the plus. Flip it, solder it. Make sure that you're covering that pad real good. Also make sure that you didn't accidentally bridge or short the solder in between. If those are connected, you're gonna have to resolve that. You don't want that connection. You don't want these two to be connected to each other. You just want them individually on the pads. It's easy to do if you're not familiar with soldering. Even if you are, it's easy to do, especially with these smaller smaller boards. All right, so the last one is green, same thing, long leg in the positive. Okay. Now if you did happen to bridge the pads, so I did not, you can kind of see just looking at it, but if you did happen to bridge them, you can either use solder wick or you can use the soldering iron. Solder wick will help you. You'll put basically a piece of copper wire down, and it'll wick when you put the soldering iron there, and it'll hopefully remove the bridge. The solder sucker, you can heat it up and then suck the solder into your into your solder sucker, and that should remove it as well. All right, so those look pretty good. Now I'm gonna cut the wires. I'm gonna check one more time. Long leg, long leg, long leg, all on the right. And you can see the little plus on the silk screen, so we are good. I'm just gonna clip those and try to get them as flush as you can. All right, so that looks pretty good. Okay, on this next step, we're gonna be installing the switch, the speaker, and the potentiometer. So these are all pretty easy. You should be practically a pro by now. So based on the instructions, the switch is going to be down here, SW1. So this will go in here. And then you want the speaker. Now this is important. You need to make sure that your plus and minus are correct. So there's a plus and a minus on the underside, and you can see the plus and minus on here, so you got to match that up. And then you've got your potentiometer, and that's going to go right here where it says RV1, and that can only really go in one way. So, all right, we're going to do those. Okay, another trick with the multimeter is we're going to check for continuity to make sure we have the switch in the right position. So if I touch my two probes, I should hear a beep when I have my multimeter set to continuity mode. So on mine, you're going to see a little sound, and I was just hitting select until I saw that. So I'm going to check the continuity. Right now I believe it's open, and it is. And then when I close it, I should no longer have continuity. Oops. Which I don't. So that means I have the switch correct. So I'm going to put the switch like this on the far right. Okay, so I've inserted the switch after checking continuity to make sure I've got it in the right position. I'm going to flip it over, and then I'm just going to count on it to hold in place, which it should. And then I'm going to solder it up. And this is a little bit tighter soldering. Just adjust the board so that it's where you want it. Okay. And double check everything, looks good. Make sure you got your little mini volcano. And then you should be able to turn it. If you do happen to have a gap under your switch, which I don't, but because it's all the way in, what you can do is you can apply heat, just kind of push it in, rock it while it's heated, so you can push it down more flush with the board. Next one we're going to do is the speaker. So it's the same process, just again, this is important. You got to make sure that your polarity is correct. So my plus is this leg here. So I'm going to match my plus leg and my minus leg. So these, this is a prototype board. The legs aren't as, the spacing isn't quite right, but it's easy to fix if yours is off a little too. You can just kind of bend it and then finesse it in how you want it. Okay, I've inserted the speaker, I've double checked the polarity, and now I'm just going to solder it up. Okay, that's done. Alright, the last thing I've got to do is the potentiometer. So this can only go in one way. So you're going to insert that in like so. And then you're going to flip it over. It's actually probably not a bad idea to do the potentiometer before the speaker. So I'm going to remove the speaker. I'll go ahead and show that on the camera just in case you're interested in how I do that. So you're just going to heat it up, and then you're going to apply a little bit of heat, and then you don't want to pull it too fast. There you go. So you need to apply heat to both, and then you can pull it out pretty easily. So the nice thing about these boards, pretty much everything, the ones with 4 are a little trickier, but you can still do that method, but you can pretty much remove just about anything. It's not always easy, but it is possible. You can also use a reflow or a rework station. So I'm going to go ahead and do the potentiometer now. Flip it over. And then I will go ahead and connect that. Solder it to the board. Pretty much same process. Didn't get quite enough on that one. Okay, those are done. So in this case, you can see the potentiometer is a little off. So what I do is I hold it, and then I just kind of push it in, heat it up a little bit where it's uneven. You don't want to really worry about it too much. It might just be kind of the way it fits. So yeah, it's actually more the way it fits. All right, so the potentiometer is done. I'm going to do the speaker again. So again, double check. I'm going to demonstrate how to use a solder sucker, because now I could just heat these up and fit it in that way, but I want to start over like I never soldered it. And plus I'll demonstrate how to use a solder sucker. So what you want to do is you want to push it in all the way, and then you're going to take your soldering iron, hold it over where the solder is, and inject it. And you're just going to keep doing that until all the solder is pretty much removed. And sometimes it's hard to get all of it, but I may not be able to get everything out. But that's not a problem. You can also use wick to do that. So I think it's good enough. So plus and minus. Okay, I've got it nice and lined up. Since there's solder in there, I can kind of hold them in position. There's still a little bit in there. I didn't get it all out, but that's not a big deal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to carefully hold the position, and then I'm going to carefully push on this and push it through. I'll do that with each leg. It's a little tricky, but it's possible. Okay, so you're just going to hold this, and you're going to push that leg right in. So I can feel it moving in. All right, so now you can see it's being held. We're good. I'm going to add a little more solder. Make sure I'm on the right part. Yep. Actually, it looks like it's got plenty of solder, so. Okay. These are just little tricks you learn along the way. Repositioning is pretty easy. If you're not quite happy how it's angled, you can kind of put a little heat on it. You don't want to hold it there long though. Maybe a couple seconds max. So there, now it's nice and straight and even. All right.